Thank you so much. First, I'm going to make sure this works. Great. Okay. I am the least expert person on this panel up here, so I'm going to start sort of high level and talk to you about a few things, just 3 slides really quickly. The first is why offshore wind. The second is the West Coast potential, and the third is what is Washington State's role in that? And then I'm going to turn it over to the experts to dig into the details for us. So on this question of why offshore wind, I think probably everybody in this room knows the top level answer to that, which is because we're trying to address climate change. We spent the last 2 centuries burning through as much carbon as we could, and we realized that's a mistake. We need to get off that system as quickly as possible and transition to a renewable energy economy as fast as we can. And one of the most promising areas for generation with limited impacts on the natural environment is offshore wind. One thing that we need to understand on the West Coast is that we're pretty late to the game. Asia and Europe are significantly ahead of the United States generally, and the East Coast is quite a ways ahead of the West Coast in the development of offshore wind. There are no turbines currently spinning in the United States, but we're close on the East Coast. We're getting there. And in the West Coast, we're looking ahead to an auction in California later this year. In Oregon, I think maybe as early as next year. And there's a couple of things happening on the in Washington that I'm sure other panelists will talk about today. The reason we're so far behind is probably a couple of major reasons. One is the technology is a little bit harder here. Our continental shelf drops off really quickly, and so in order to install offshore wind on the West Coast, it has to be floating, as opposed to the fixed foundation offshore wind that you see predominate in Europe and elsewhere. And so the technology to make that possible has been coming along, but it's really not, it's an innovation as much as it's bringing 2 existing technologies together. One is what you think of as the tower and the turbine, and the other is the platform. And you might think, wow, floating platforms that can manage a turbine of the size that Brian was talking about, that's actually already been existing for a long time. We just use it to extract oil and gas, and now we're going to take that technology and wed it to a new and exciting thing, and that is a giant 900-foot tall turbine out in the ocean. So that for us is really a critical component. But why else offshore wind? Why not other renewable technologies that might be simpler because they're onshore? Well, 2 things. Brian mentioned the extraordinary capacity of doing something of 20 megawatts. We simply haven't been able to do that on land, which may not be intuitive, right? Like, how much harder would it be to do on a floating platform than it would be on land? But when you think about the scale of a single turbine blade that is the length of a football field, how do you move that on land? That's really, you'd have to build it in place, basically. Whereas on water, we can move those things fairly easily. In fact, we already know how to move very big things on water. And so maritime is actually a really great place to develop these mega scale wind turbines. The second is that what they call the levelized cost of energy for floating offshore wind is coming down significantly enough that it's going to be close to at par with some of our best renewables. And it then also comes along with it the benefit of being something that's a little bit more consistent offshore than inland. And so, you know, as we all know with solar, it turns off at night. Floating offshore wind will not. And so it can balance some of those load demands as well. The second question I promised to answer is, what is the West Coast potential? So I want to thank Mark Larson for letting me use a couple of the graphics you'll see today. This demonstrates in a couple of different call areas on the West Coast where we think some of the best potential is within reach of Puget Sound ports like the Port of Seattle. So you can see working our way up from Humboldt here all the way up to the Olympic Peninsula, and you can see that some of the best wind is in that border area between Oregon and California. And so that's why they've been identified in part as some of the earliest. The other is the regulatory environment on the West Coast. For California, that has been operating under a consent decree for air quality since I think the 1970s, they're constantly seeking ways to replace the burning of fossil fuels and internal combustion engines with renewable energy. And they also have a huge population to support. So they are accelerating their offshore wind programs as quickly as possible, both at the state legislative level, in the governor's office, and in collaboration with the federal government. In Oregon, they have been exploring offshore wind for a long time. They've had a very supportive scientific community at the university, at Oregon State University. They've had a community, coastal communities that are supportive of it because of the potential for workforce development there. And they also recognize that they've got an imbalance in terms of their energy grid, and they want to try to balance that out too. And finally, in Washington, we'll get into that in a little bit, but the knock on Washington is that we have so much hydro renewable energy that we aren't really going to need it. But now we're realizing that because of the drive to electrify everything from commercial buildings, eventually residential buildings, all of our cars, that the load demands that we anticipated even 5 or 10 years ago are no longer accurate. They're way too low for what we're really anticipating we're going to need. And so even Washington is going to want to start looking at how do we but how do we augment that load so that we can serve the needs of an electrical future, right? So what is the potential in Washington State? I think the key piece for us to think about is, how about in the next 10 years? And for me as a Port of Seattle Commissioner, what I'm thinking about is, I really want Washington State, for Puget Sound and the Columbia River ports, to be a part of the fabrication and assembly, essentially the supply chain for offshore wind anywhere in the Pacific. So not just Washington, but California, Oregon, even partners in Korea and Japan that have set really audacious goals for offshore wind and floating offshore wind as well. How can Washington State participate in the development of a supply chain for floating offshore wind anywhere in the Pacific? And I think to meet those audacious goals, like the goal set by the Biden administration for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, we need this kind of initiative here in Washington State to support it. It may be that for 10 years, all we do is build turbines or platforms or other elements of the supply chain for Oregon and California and maybe some international partners. But even that would prepare us for a future in which you could imagine floating offshore wind on the coast of Washington State. So I think that about does it for my time, and hopefully I wrapped it up in time.